Now we've gone over setup, we've gone over tires, and we've gone over driving style. Now let's go over maintenance. Maintenance is one of the main pillars of being fast on the track. Without a thorough checking over of your car, any amount of setup or setup changing you'll do will do very little for you. There's very little use in copying some pro's setup if your suspension is binding and theirs isn't. Before we begin, however, I'd like to remind you to hit the bright red subscribe button in the bottom right if you haven't already and like my videos. Also, if you can think of any maintenance tips or future video ideas, feel free to put them in the comment section below. Without further delay, let's begin. Speaking of suspension, let's begin with the shocks themselves. This is probably the easiest thing on your car to maintain. After all, they are quite easy to remove from the car and are fairly simple to disassemble so long as you have the instruction manual handy. The first and easiest thing you can do is simply replace all of the old shock fluid with fresh fluid. The reason why you'd want to do this, especially for 10 scales, because there are no shock boots on 10 scale shocks, at least to my knowledge. What shock boots do is prevent dirt and other such grime from getting into the actual fluid itself. This keeps everything smooth and running properly. However, if you happen to be running on something that isn't extremely well-groomed carpet, chances are that some dirt or gunk is going to get in there. Even on said well-groomed carpet, you still want to do this. Doing so will help keep the shocks running smooth. Next thing you'll want to do is replace the X-rings and spacers as they can get worn out over extended use. After that, if you've still got binding, then you're going to want to check the shock bodies and the shock shafts. Check to see if they're bent and need to be replaced. Worst case scenario, you'll have to replace the whole shock itself. This same sort of mindset applies to the differential as well. Now there are two types of differentials out there. Gear diffs, which are usually seen on high bite carpet and Astro cars, and ball diffs, which are usually seen on dirt cars, at least when it comes to 10 scale two-wheel drive. Ball diffs, in my opinion, are a bit trickier to surface than gear diffs, so let's go over them first. The first thing you'll want to do is grab a towel or some other kind of surface where you can store the parts of the diff without losing them. My dad likes to use tape. Then you'll want to take the diff apart. Be sure to do this slowly so you don't have the ball diffs going all over the place where you can't find them. After this, you'll want to either flip or straight up replace the diff rings themselves. If they have that sort of inner grooved ring on one side, then you can flip them. If they're on both sides, it may be time to replace them. Same thing with the diff balls themselves. If they feel crunchy or uneven, then it's time to replace those as well. After that, put everything back together with fresh diff grease and you're all set. Now things in my opinion are a tad bit easier when it comes to servicing a gear diff. The way you treat it is similar to a shock, the only real difference is how long it takes to do it. Simply remove the diff, remove the 4 screws holding it together, and there you go, you have access to the inside. The first thing you'll want to do is remove the idler gears from your diff. After this, grab a towel and place the diff upside down on the towel like this and leave it there to sit. Because diff fluid is much thicker than shock fluid, you simply can't pour it out. You have to let it sort of creep out on its own over time. I usually let it sit for a few hours to even a full day if need be. During this time, you may take the time to service or replace any parts of the diff that need it. The idler gears, if they're made of metal, your car can handle a decent amount of punishment, so all you really need to worry about is cleaning them off. If they're made of plastic, you might want to either upgrade to metal or simply replace them every once in a while, along with the diff gasket. Once the diff housing is fully drained, take this time to rebuild your diff to your desired specs. In this case, I'm replacing the stock 5K diff fluid with 10K. Once you put everything together, make sure everything spins well and doesn't crunch. After this, you're good to go. Back to suspension binding. If after all that your suspension is still binding, you might want to check all the armholes and hinge pins. Any imperfections here can cause binding and throw off your car's performance drastically. The easiest way to check if you have suspension binding in this manner is simply to remove the shocks and move the arms up and down. If they don't move freely, you might have an issue. Go through all the hinge pins and make sure they're all clean and not rusted. For the holes, if they're the issue, grind them out with a hole grinder like this and see if that helps. After doing all of this, you should have relatively free suspension. Now another thing on your car you're going to want to check periodically is your bearings. Having bad bearings can wreak havoc on how your car performs, just like binding. Now you can go one of two ways with this, and neither of them are really fun. You can either go through and meticulously clean out every bearing on the car, or you can go through and replace every bearing on the car. Personally, I choose the latter, but if you don't want to spend that kind of money, I linked a video from Ryan Harris on how to service your bearings. One thing you can do is replace all of your bearings with ceramic bearings to make them spin more freely and last longer. I finally pulled the trigger on these Wits Racing ceramic bearings and they spin much more freely than the stockers, especially on my low C. Regardless of whether or not you have regular or ceramic bearings, it's important to check periodically to make sure they don't seize up on you and ruin your setup. Now that everything is rebuilt, let's make it look a little bit more appealing under the body. Now there's a few things you can do to make your car look appealing, and one of them is wiring. Now if you look at any pro or fast guy's car, chances are they look very neat and very clean in terms of wiring and just in general. This isn't just because they like the way that it looks. Excess wire is excess weight, and any weight you can save in stock racing is time you're going to save. Now making your ESC wires clean and tidy is fairly easy. Just measure out how much wire you need and go from there. The wires that connect to your receiver can be a bit tricky, however. Now I'm aware that there are ways to shorten these wires, but most people, including me, don't have the patience to do that. Instead, we're just going to curl them. If you've ever seen someone's car with curled wires like these, you'll know what I'm talking about. To make your wires look like this, simply take the wire that you're coiling and wrap it around something long and thin like this driver, for example. Wrap it around as tightly as you can without pulling on the actual plug, and then pull the driver out. There you go, now you have a coiled wire. Multiply this by however many wires you need to do this with, and you're all set. In all honesty, that last tip was more or less to help make your car look better, and not really go faster, though feeling better about your car tends to make you drive better. That's all for now. If you liked the video, comment what you thought and subscribe if you want to see more. I'll see you later.